In this video, I'm going to be ranking all of the Beethoven piano sonatas in order of difficulty. The most difficult ones are going to go into the top tier, which I've labeled insane. Below that, we have extremely hard, harder, and then just average Beethoven challenge, more approachable ones, and then the Opus 49s. Now, I've been wanting to make this video for a long time, especially since so many of you in the comments have asked again and again and again that I do it, but I've always been a little hesitant because I know it's subjective and people are going to complain and not everyone's going to agree and people are going to get mad. But then I thought, whatever, it's YouTube. Some of you would complain even if Barenboim was posting this video. So my encouragement for you, try to sit back, relax, enjoy some Beethoven, and when I do have a pick that you strongly disagree with, have a fun conversation down in the comments. That's what we're here for. Enjoy some classical music. We're kicking things off right at the beginning with Opus 2, number 1, the one that goes. And this one fits really well into my more approachable category, and it also gives me a chance to talk about what I mean by that from the beginning. This is a Beethoven sonata. It's hard. It's a big piece, especially if you play all 4 movements. You have to respect Beethoven sonatas when you play them. They're all extremely challenging. I'm putting things in this category that are just easier than what I would just call the average Beethoven sonata. Ones that if you're looking for ones to do first, they're good candidates to do that. It's not easy. Do not hear I'm putting this in an easy category. These are extremely difficult pieces. All the Beethoven sonatas are hard, but relative to something like Waldstein we'll see later, this is much more approachable. And it also has this gorgeous middle movement. So if you do play the first movement, definitely get around to playing the second movement too. I mean, obviously try to play all 4 movements, but don't skip out on this movement. Opus 2, number 2 in A major really breaks the misconception that Beethoven sonatas start out easy. They're all easy, then they all get hard as you go along. I would put this one, it's kind of on the line. I consider it slightly harder than maybe the average Beethoven sonata. It's close. It's not super into that category, but the first movement is pretty challenging and long, requires a lot of clarity and passage works, arpeggios and scales up and down. The second movement, which I talked about in a recent video, is fairly easy for second movements. I mean, obviously, as always, Beethoven sonata, slow movements are challenging musically always, but easier technically. But in the third and the fourth movements of this one are pretty hard. So I think it bumps into that slightly harder than average category because it has 3 pretty challenging movements. Now for Opus 2, number 3, we're going to run into kind of a common problem when ranking the Beethoven sonatas, or more broadly when ranking any piece. But some of these pieces, like Opus 2, number 3, have a couple extremely challenging techniques, like the thirds at the beginning, also the If you were to judge some of those techniques alone, it would land it in the harder category. However, if we do that for every single sonata, we say, oh, this has one specific thing that is definitely a harder technique, they're all going to end up in harder. So I would actually call this one average, because the average Beethoven sonata will have some techniques that are extremely advanced and challenging and you'll really have to work on. That's actually not abnormal. So as we go throughout this video, if I say a piece and you say, well, you thought that was average or more approachable, but this one measures so hard, that is typical. Beethoven will almost always have some techniques that are extremely hard. Opus 7, the Grand Sonata, is a really tricky one to rank because even compared to other Beethoven sonatas, people have vastly different ideas of how fast the fast movements should go. I mean, if you're more in the camp of, it's obviously going to be a lot easier than if you're in the fast camp. Same thing with the third movement. It is an allegro in 3/4. So some people interpret it more like a, that'd be a little on the slow side, but some people play it more like a scherzo in 1, like, which makes it so much more difficult. So really depending on tempo in this one, I'm going to drop it into the average Beethoven just to be safe. However, those 2 tempos, you do the faster side of both of those, it's definitely on the trickier side because some things become so challenging if you play that tempo. But I'm probably a little more conservative with the tempos on this one, so I'm going to put it into average. Opus 10, number 1 is a great piece. Starts out like Pathetique, but it's not. I like it as a teaching piece because it kind of gives you maybe that Pathetique sounds at the beginning, but it is much simpler overall than Pathetique. It also, though, has this gorgeous middle movement, which I should really flip to play properly. What'd I do? and then a really fun spy themed third movement. Compared to Pathetique, actually, the first movement I'd say is quite a bit easier. The second movement is actually much more difficult than this movement here, because it has a lot more stuff going on. So the second movement is harder, but because the first movement is so much easier than the first movement of Pathetique, I'm going to put it down here in the more approachable. I think it's actually a really good teaching one for someone's first couple sonatas. Now for Opus 10 number 2, I've been struggling a little bit where I'm going to rank it, because when I play through it for fun, it seems like one of the harder sonatas. It gets some really fast notes. There's some challenging passages. My caveat is I haven't really studied it. It's just been like a sight reading exercise several different times, and I've crashed and burned a lot. However, I've heard from people who have studied it that it's really not as hard as I think it is. It is much simpler. So I'm going to sort of trust that wisdom and average it out a little bit. It looks challenging and it's weird enough. It has enough hand crossing that's weird to sight read, but people always say, no, it's really not that bad once you get into it. So I'm going to put it in the average Beethoven, kind of averaging out what I feel like it is when I sight read it and what other people say it is. I'm going to stick Opus 10 number 3 in D major into the insane category, because you have to be pretty insane if you like it in the first place. I'm joking. For those of you who don't get it, I made a big Beethoven tier list a couple years ago where I ranked all the sonatas based on how much I like them. This is one that's not my personal favorite, and a lot of people weren't happy about it. So no, I don't actually think it's insane difficulty. I also don't think you have to be insane if you like it. Pathetique Sonata is a difficult one. In some ways, I view it as like an average Beethoven sonata. It's almost like the baseline, partially because it has a challenging first movement, a tricky last movement, and the middle movement's a little on the easier side. So it doesn't bump it up into harder in my mind. At the same time, like, it sort of has like the Moonlight or the Clair de Lune effect or the Fur Elise effect, where you play it so much, like, you don't appreciate that it's challenging anymore, right? Because you've seen it too often, and maybe it really is challenging and we just don't appreciate it anymore. So part of me could almost bump it into harder because the third movement is trickier than we often get it credit for, and I might do just that. I have gotten to where I really like Opus 14 number 1. This is such a fun piece. It has a lot going for it, and it is more approachable than many of the Beethoven sonatas. So hopefully you're kind of seeing a trend here. Because something's an early Beethoven sonata does not mean it is automatically easy. However, there are a few more of the more approachable ones on the early side, and E major is a lot of fun. Now, don't hear what I'm not saying. By calling this piece more approachable, I'm not saying it's not good. This is a really fun one. The reason I love teaching it is because it gives you some of the Beethoven quirkiness and oddness and some chromaticism that should not belong together. It also has that awesome middle movement that goes. I will warn you though, that the last page of the third movement does get pretty tricky with this back and forth texture, like. But the whole time the left hand has triplets. So it's like. But like 4 times faster. Opus 14 number 2 starts a trend of the G major sonatas being a little bit on the quirky side. And I also really like that I bumped Pathetique up. Maybe I shouldn't have called this category average Beethoven, but I wouldn't want to see this in the same category as Pathetique or Opus 2 number 2 A major. By the way, I consider Opus 2 number 2 an A major, maybe slightly harder than Pathetique, but I'm not going to go through every single row and rank those as well. The whole point of the tier is that you have tiers. They're not necessarily put in order within the tiers, but I think this is a good spot for an average one. So I'm happy with my decision to bump Pathetique up. Sonata number 11 in B flat major, some people call it the little hammer clavier because it's big and massive and shares the same key as the hammer clavier B flat major. I like to think of it more as like the little piano concerto because it has so many giant concerto-like textures, almost like Beethoven is practicing all of his big giant chords and oscillating chords and broken patterns and everything and octaves in the hands instead of single note melodies having octaves. It also has a really interesting slow movement with tons of fast notes. I think those two things combined is enough to bump it up to the harder category. But just take a second to listen to someone else who's actually spent hours and hours and hours on this piece doing some of these piano textures. Opus 26 in A flat major is a super unique sonata. It starts out with a theme and variation. But it's called the Funeral March Sonata because after that theme and variations, you go to a scherzo and then you end up in. But even though it's super cool and unique, it's going to be average as far as our list goes today because it's not exceptionally difficult compared to the other sonatas. Definitely not easy, but not exceptionally more difficult. E flat major, opus 27 number 1, is actually most famous for being 27 number 1 and not 27 number 2, which you'll see in just a second here. This is another one where tempo plays a huge factor. I've seen it played almost just ignoring the cut time. It ends up being a tricky one to rank. We were only considering the first two movements. We're going to be somewhere in that more approachable to average. The third movement, though, is a monster. And I don't know a monster enough to bump it into the harder category. I'm kind of tempted to stick it back down in this average Beethoven. I mean, I should have the most in the average Beethoven difficulty. That would kind of make sense. All right, on to Moonlight Sonata. Let the hate begin. I'm sure 25% of the people who click on this video are just going to skip ahead and see where Moonlight Sonata is ranked and then complain about it because there's a large number of people who are under the impression it belongs in the insane category. It's the hardest one. If you don't believe me, just go read YouTube comment sections for a while. A lot of people vouch for this being like the most difficult, or right up there at the most difficult sonatas. And it's not anywhere close. Also, people put it down here at the very bottom sometimes, and it's not. The third movement is pretty challenging. By the way, if you're not familiar, that's your first movement. I was assuming all of you knew this one. For me, it lands around the average category. Now, again, if you watch this and you think this is the most difficult one, I would just say try to learn all the pathétique. If you've played Moonlight, what often happens is someone has played Moonlight and maybe only Moonlight or Moonlight and some of the Opus 49s, and they haven't played pathétique or played Opus 2 number 2. Try playing some of those pieces. What you'll find is that even though the third movement of Moonlight is very challenging and very fast, and I've heard it performed by forte pianists before who go so fast it would be just like a Liszt etude to play. However, what you'll find in lots of the other Beethoven sonatas is like 64 different challenges that drive you crazy compared to like a couple extreme challenges in the third movement of Moonlight. So it ends up being a difficult one to rank because the range from the first movement to the third movement is as great as any other sonata in difficulty when you compare it to movements. Okay, with Moonlight Sonata aside, up next we have another named sonata, Pastoral. Now, those of you who've been around the channel know that if we were ranking it based on how much I liked it, it would be up here at the top. However, you know how you want the pieces that you love to be like more difficult as well. There's something about being harder and more challenging. It makes it like more respectable. This is where it gets a little dicey. Like if you were to look at just the third movement of Moonlight Sonata and compare it to any single movement of Pastoral, you might go with Moonlight. But you're talking about 4 different challenging movements, 3 of them fairly challenging, with extremely different challenging techniques compared to Moonlight, where the first movement's much easier and the second movement's pretty easy. So it might bump it up to the harder category. I mean, I do like it, so I'm slightly biased, but let's leave it there for now. Okay, the 3 wildly famous Opus 31 sonatas. Opus 31, number 1, G major. The famous Beethoven Can't Play His Hands at the Same Time sonata. And also, as far as difficulty goes, just a case in point where normally when Beethoven is difficult to play. They are really tricky configurations. That's what really makes Beethoven hard, not just the flat out speed, but the patterns. But sometimes speed can be the challenge. I think it's part of the reason why you see this piece played in contests a lot too, because it is just more flashy and it is really, really fast. Depending on tempo, I could almost make this our first extremely hard. This is the problem with tier list always, is you're like, oh, I don't think it belongs to be in the same category as Pastoral, but I know it's going to be in the extremely hard category later. And does it just belong in that list either? Let's do it. I anticipate it being the weakest of the extremely hards, but I'm not ashamed of saying it's harder than Pathetique or Opus 2 number 2. Let's move on to Tempest. I think Tempest is a good candidate to go into the harder category for much the opposite reason as Pastoral is in the harder category. In some ways, I view Pastoral overall as more difficult. And I mentioned at the beginning of the video, you can't just find one or two techniques and say, well, this is really hard, so it deserves to go into the harder category, because everything would go into the harder category. Tempest has enough of those tricky things like repeated notes and that really fast third movement, and more relatively difficult to pull off slow movement compared to some of the other slow movements of Beethoven. I think it bumps it up. It's like specific things, but there's not just one or two. Pastoral, the floor is pretty high. Nothing is too easy. I feel like the floor is a little lower in Tempest, but there's so many challenges that kind of stick out. I think it deserves to be in the harder category. The Hunt, Opus 31, number 3, starts out this crazy sounding chord, and that's the only good thing about it. No, I'm just kidding. This one I think is a great one to stick into our average Beethoven category. The right hand has some really fast runs, but they often happen when the left hand is resting, so they are much more approachable in that sense. Up next, we have the Opus 49s, which I made their own category for them, and I called it Opus 49s. If you don't know the story, Beethoven didn't want these sonatas published in the first place, and so they're not obviously on the same tier as its other sonatas. They're not terrible if you want to play them or you want to give them to your students because they're not ready for the other sonatas. That's completely fine. People will act like you can't play these pieces. You can totally play them, especially if you have a student who isn't ready for anything in the more approachable category, or you want to play some Beethoven and you're not ready for the more approachable tier yet. They're fine. They are definitely a step below quality-wise and difficulty-wise than everything else. And with that, we have now officially entered the Opus 50s. I'm going to go ahead and put Waldstein Sonata and Appassionata up here in the extremely hard tier. It's a little hard to understand unless you have played one of these pieces for yourself. I have played one and not the other. Just how massive they are compared to what has come before them. I mean, you can have a great day of practice and feel like you learned so much, worked out so many tricky passages, and then you look up and you're like, oh, there's still 11 pages to go. In the first movement alone, they're just big pieces, and really line by line, they present new challenges for you, and they're really long. Endurance kind of becomes a factor when you're like, can you sit down and play for 25 or 30 minutes straight, not only getting everything right, but having that technique to keep it up to the end of a 30-minute piece. We're not talking about like a recital with 3 different pieces where you can't take a break, but you just go and play notes. And then Opus 54 is somewhere between this more approachable and average Beethoven sonata. It's often called the valley between the two, mountains of Waldstein in Appassionata, which is pretty appropriate. It is much shorter, and also, not saying it's easy. Again, nothing is easy in this list except maybe the Opus 49s are somewhat easier, but not saying it's easy, but it is much more approachable than many of the other Beethovens, especially the Beethovens that happen right around it. Okay, F sharp major is another really tricky one to rank. Like Waldstein and Appassionata are not tricky to rank. They're up there. This one's challenging. When I played it, I felt like the first movement was just in the average category, and the second movement was tricky, had some really tricky techniques. It's a weird effect, right? When I had played the F sharp major, I was much better as a pianist than when I played Pathetique Sonata. I was like 5 years into college, like undergrad and then in grad school, from the time I had played Pathetique Sonata. So it's really difficult to compare the two. I felt like F sharp major was pretty easy to learn and Pathetique was like really challenging at the time. It's definitely trickier and definitely takes a more mature musician to play. But again, it's a little hard to compare the difference because I was so much better as a pianist when I learned that one. And I think my decision is going to automatically pay off because I'm going to put the G major opus 79 in the average Beethoven category, slightly below F sharp major, and I think that's a good place for it. Up next is Le Bevel, or Le Doux if you want to be French, and it's going to go into the harder category. I can't see putting it into the extremely hard category, but that third movement is really fast. Of everything in this harder category, I would say Pathetique consistently looks weaker. That's a tricky spot for it. I don't know if it's looking worse and worse the more this gets added. All right, E minor, opus 90. I think a lot of you are going to disagree with me on this one, but there's a good reason, I believe. I'm going to put this one into just the average Beethoven sonata. The second movement isn't anything exceptional. The first movement, I think, is where a lot of people find to be pretty challenging. My good reasoning is I can reach a 10th pretty easily, so those tricky figures of the arpeggios moving up and kind of broken chords but spread out by 10th, I don't find overly hard to reach, so I don't actually find this so challenging. I kind of get the sense that people who find this movement really hard must really struggle with those techniques, which make a lot of sense. If you could barely reach an octave, that's a really tricky technique that requires a lot of jumping. So I don't find it particularly intimidating. However, if that reach was really on the big side for you, it might bump it up a tier or two, just so you're aware. If you're thinking, oh, Brian said this one wasn't that difficult, hopefully you didn't just skip to the end and see that, but you hear me right now saying, yeah, but if you had a smaller hand, this would be a pretty challenging one. Okay, we are reaching almost unrankable territory here because it'd be pretty easy just to put all the last 5 sonatas in like an extremely high tier, but A major, opus 101 is one of my favorite sonatas, as you know, and I'm going to put it right up here next to Waldstein and Pastoral. You know, I'm a little torn about this G major. I think it's going to end up looking like it doesn't belong where it's at. Oh, part of me really wants to shift it down, but I'm not going to yet. People, not you guys, people who skip the end of the video will complain about it one way or another and not hear on my struggle. But back to 101. 101 is crazy good. The first movement is very deceptive. If you play the first movement only, you're going to think, oh, this is one of the easier Beethoven sonatas, especially considering the late Beethoven sonatas, right? The scherzo is insane. It's stupid. It's not stupid in a bad way, but just it's insanely difficult. And then you get to that third movement and the fugue is really stressful. But I haven't found when I played it, the fugue wasn't the most stressful part. It was just the basic theme in the final movement was really challenging, I thought, like being accurate with all the octave jumps. This thing right here. I'm not saying the fugue is easy by any means. It's extremely challenging, but just overall, a fourth movement or final movement, if you want to count the third movement as just an intro, you know, to the third movement. But the final movement, crazy challenging. And then that scherzo is really stressful. So all the way up to the extremely hard category. All right, the next one is the easiest one to rank on the list. I'm putting Hammerklavier at the very top, all by itself, in the insane category. I'm one of the people who believe it is just a step above the other ones. If nothing else, just in length. Like I mentioned with Appassionata and Waldstein, one of the challenges you might not anticipate is just the length of those sonatas. We're not talking like a 20-minute or 25, but now with Hammerklavier, we're talking like a 40-minute experience. And it's not quite like I've played the fifth concerto. With concertos, you have moments of rest, moments where you're doing little things and the orchestra is carrying it, right? With a sonata, it's just you. It's just you playing this for 40 something minutes, and obviously it has the super long slow movement, which is extremely difficult to pull off. But the first movement is just really hard. I know some people kind of consider Appassionata, Waldstein this. Some of the other later ones we'll get to in a second kind of in the same tier. Not me. I think this is definitely a step above the rest. Just to be clear, not necessarily in quality, but we're talking about difficulty today. Now, I also used to be someone who considered the last 3 sonatas all pretty similar in difficulty, but I've changed on that over time, and I think that E major is a little easier than the other ones. And, you know, with it going there, I'm going to go ahead and drop down G major into the next tier. I think this looks a lot better to me. E major, while, again, I say for the 1000th time, it is Beethoven. It is extremely challenging. And musically speaking, this one's really hard to pull off. But you could say that about everything from F sharp major on, everything from A on, you could say it's really difficult to pull off musically. That's just kind of the nature of later Beethoven. But E major does have a lot of respite where it is a little easier. So the hard stuff more sticks out of the texture rather than it all being extremely difficult. But this is one of those opinions. I don't hold that strongly. I might in a couple years switch again and want to push it back up to the extremely hard category. That being said, I think A flat major is slightly harder right now because it does have the big fugue, which is really challenging. And I feel like that first movement is difficult to get the right sound at the speed it's at, which ends up not really being an interpretation issue in your mind. You might know what you want to do. It's just, do you have the technique to actually do it? And finally, we've come to Opus 111, the final sonata. If I was ranking just the first movement, it probably would only go into this harder category. I think some people are under the impression that the first movement is crazy difficult. I mean, it is, considering all Beethoven's really difficult, but I don't find it just wildly harder than everything else. However, that final movement definitely bumps it up to extremely hard. It's not just interpreting it's difficult, even though lots of people play it, I think, and don't know how to interpret it, but technically speaking, it is so hard to play as well. Overall, I'm pretty happy how everything looks now that's down the screen. I do really like these bottom five. Just know they're not easy. Just know they're not going to be like walk in the park. I'm not telling you they're easy pieces. They are advanced pieces. They're just going to be more attainable than anything else on the list. And remember, before you go down to the comments and start replying to everyone else and telling them how stupid they are, we need some spaces where we can talk about music in a positive way. So let's keep it that way. Encourage each other, ask questions to each other, build everyone up, and have fun talking about Beethoven. See you guys.